Day 550 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than, bit of a milestone here, 260,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 550 in the past 24 hours. Then as for hardware losses, 6 tanks, 15 APVs, and 24 artillery. Indeed, a whopping amount there. Then we'll head back over to the map as a pretty significant fire broke out in Russia this weekend. This time it was at a pyrotechnics warehouse in Kemerovo, which happens to be very far away in southwest Siberia. And some of you might be thinking, come on Juzzy, give me a break, or pull the other one mate, right as images of, say, Gene Simmons and Kiss on Stage come to mind, but pyrotechnics are actually used in a variety of military applications as well, including for use cases such as illumination, smoke screens, flares, signaling, and even decoys or location decoys. Now, although the cause of the fire is not yet known, though it may likely have been caused due to human error or even sabotage, something that can be said for certain is simply that this is not assisted towards Russia's war effort in Ukraine, just like so many other factories and warehouses going up in flames over in Russia in the past year or so. It's never ending. Then also in Russia, on the border oblasts of Kursk and Bryansk. So, as Bryansk governor claimed, the shooting down of a drone overnight, but also 6 explosions were recorded in Kursk, potentially being air defenses going off as well from Ukrainian drones. And you know what? I remember how Russian trolls were saying last year how it was too expensive for Ukraine and NATO to fire, say, AIM-9 sidewinders, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit to combat against cheaper Russian drones, or anything for that matter. But all I can say now is that, well, in the famous but comedically erroneous words of Michael Scott, well, how the turntables. As this is just the beginning of what the new landscape should look like for Russia now. Then we'll head across to the Ukrainian map and take a quick look at the Donbas today, as the AFU continued to push Russia's front lines back a little bit further, just south of Bakhmut in Klishchivka, so right around there. As the AFU is actually in the process of clearing the streets and houses in your typical urban warfare setting. Then also in this very vicinity, there was a very slow cook-off of a Russian T-72 tank, which was struck by a Ukrainian FPV loitering munition, but also in combination with artillery fire as well. But then, not to be outdone, also nearby to Bakhmut, a detracked Russian BMD-4M infantry fighting vehicle was also targeted by an FPV drone, with the cook-off eventually leading to a turret toss this time. And the massive irony in all of this is that the BMD-4M infantry fighting vehicle is actually not of Soviet heritage, but rather is Russian-built, first produced in 2008. So why on earth do they still contain the known design flaw of munitions stored in the turret, making the vehicles still susceptible to turret tossing? Surely Russian designers would have heeded the lessons of the past 50 years, but of course we know that's not possible with the rampant corruption in the Russian military, where they instead just made slight modifications from the previous models and then misappropriating the R&D, so the research and development funding, to their own yachts. Super yachts. Then we'll head across to the southern axis, as Ukrainian forces have made newly confirmed tactical gains in the past 24 hours just east of Robotyne, in the direction of Verbova. We'll zoom right in for that one there, as they widen the flanks against the Russian forces. Also, the AFU has cleared and penetrated some of the heavily mined areas along Russia's main line of defense in this area, which is absolutely crucial for any side to have this ability for going forward into this war. But I'll try not to hammer on too much about that one there today. Then, as for Tokmak in the south, so I'll zoom out for a bit of better context here today. So there we go, Tokmak. There's been a whole bunch of reports of the Russian military begging the locals for food, but also some instances of the Russian forces stealing the locals' bedside tables and even carpets to put in the trenches and their own dugouts. And this is quite noteworthy as these complaints have been happening for about a week now regarding the logistical delivery of food and other basic human necessities is just not meeting its mark. Now, Russian soldiers have been taking to telegrams saying that they're out of food and they're really just down to their last day of dry rations, they say. Oh, but then get this, with their command saying to them that those who hold their positions, their defensive positions, will be fed. Can you imagine? I mean, held for ransom in this way. Is this what the Russian army has really come to now? How about you feed your soldiers first, give them good conditions, which then enables them to properly defend their positions? It's just a backwards army though in the end. It's actually quite embarrassing. But none of this is actually overly surprising, as it's all likely due to the land corridors that goes all the way back to the Donbas and then Russia in the east, just getting hammered by the AFU at the moment, and they cannot cope with the traffic flow and the logistics therein. Oh, and we also know that a lot of the Russian forces actually stationed here in the south right now, particularly at the Tokmak and the Orikhiv region, were actually diverted from the east in the Donbas, which means Russia doesn't appear to have any sufficient or even any actual reserves at all at this critical front line, which is all very consistent with the very fact that we can see Russia's lines of defense crumbling away in the north of where we are now. Then we'll head across just briefly today to the Kherson Oblast, as the Ukrainian army just struck a Russian arms depot in Nova Kakhovka. Now, this used to happen all the time, and it looks like there was, again, a bit of a sufficient buildup of Russian military arms in this region. Ukraine, the AFU, as always, waiting for the perfect time to strike. They saw their mark, and they just took it out. Then we'll head across to some news for today, and we'll start off with a bit of a hardware update. So the Ukrainian military has completed its training on the M1 Abrams in Germany. This was stated by Martin O'Donnell, a representative of the US forces, and about 200 soldiers were trained in total. So any week or day now, we'd hope to get an estimated date on the deployment of these tanks within Ukraine. Then in some other hardware news, some Russian hardware news that I love so much. So apparently Russia is now withdrawing their Abrams Bustin T-14 Armata tank from Ukraine. But nobody has ever seen this mythical beast actually in Ukraine. However, we've so far gathered that about the T-14's whereabouts in Ukraine, this was a few months ago now, is that maybe there was one or two sent there for morale boosting purposes in the real far east of the Donbas, somewhere very safe. And now with Russia's announced withdrawal of the tanks, they actually said that it was used several times on the battlefield. Thus, Russia has received sufficient data now to take it back to Russia for some planned improvements. But this Russian narrative is completely fabricated. Just to make it look like the T-14s are in Ukraine doing their thing, having their role, taking their place. But again, we've never seen them there, and we may never ever see them in Ukraine. Unless they bring a few prototypes back to Ukraine, which they can't do for risk of them being located, identified, and destroyed by the AFU, which would be simply too embarrassing for Russia to bear. Then in some other news, Putin signed a decree to enforce all Wagner PMC folk to swear an oath of allegiance to the Russian state now. But I legitimately don't think Putin realizes this is just horrible timing, signing a decree like this just days after the Wagner PMC boss was somehow involved in an innocent accident when his plane crashed. Not to mention Putin's short-term memory on how back in late May this year, he set a date of June 30th for the Wagner forces to all move over and sign contracts with the Russian army. You might remember that, which ultimately culminated in the failed coup or abortive mutiny events just before that date. So this is all really quite the tone-deaf response from Putin, making a decree of this caliber, because it just ends up removing any doubt from most of the Wagner PMC's personnel from their minds that Putin took out Prigozhin and that he planned this course of events this whole time. So it's not a stretch to speculate at this point, after this decree that Putin's just signed, that he's going to come up against a whole lot more pain with these new actions as well. Then in some other related news, the Russian government rapidly dismantled the Wagner PMC's cemetery in the Samara region right after Prigozhin's death. Not great timing as well. And this Wagnerite, as you can see, is quite unhappy. This cannot end well. Oh, and then to add insult to injury, the Russian FSB, which is the Russian security service, will be taking over the investigation into the plane crash that led to the death of Prigozhin, which many will argue is the exact same agency that carried out the orders to take out Prigozhin in the first place. And I mean, with all this news just like this, is Putin trying to make the Wagner PMC angry? Because that's what it feels like. So just have your popcorn on standby, guys, because we've seen things escalate internally within Russia before at just a moment's notice. Putin was clearly not counseled on these choices. He doesn't get counseled at all. He's a one-man show. Then moving across to another Russian military mobilization blunder of sorts, this one as well. So Russia managed to dangle misleading deceptive contracts and employment practices in the face of unsuspecting Cubans that were under the impression they were going to Russia and Ukraine to build houses. They're quite young, these guys, but of course, since they made it to their destination, they realized their situation was very, very different, as they're expected to fight for Russia in Ukraine. As such, they're taken to social media and trying to get the hell out of there. Oh, and then on top of that, they didn't even get paid. Not surprised again. Russia is just making the biggest and most dodgiest name for themselves on the world stage right now. That sooner or later, they're going to have no access to migrant worker inflows, which is a key component for theirs and so many other countries' economies. Then as a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys, I've got a bit of a raspy voice, so I'm just doing my best today, but yeah, so many more on the back burner for another day. So in this funny, Ukraine has hacked thousands of security cameras within Russia, the ones that have the broadcast speakers actually on the cameras themselves. Also that Ukraine could broadcast this sarcastic message about how great Russia is. And some of the reactions on the Russians' faces as they're just going about their workday are just pure gold. So that'll be it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. A little bit less in-depth than I wanted it to be. Just, yeah, a bit of a raspy voice, all of that there today. But, yeah, thanks again for watching. Please continue to like and comment. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.